Emma stood in the quiet room, her eyes glued to the open coffin in front of her. It was her father's funeral, and everything felt unreal. The room was filled with family and close friends, all of them gathered to say their final goodbyes. But for Emma, this didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt more like a dream, one she was desperate to wake up from. Her father had always been a strong, kind man. He had been there for her every step of the way, from her first day of school to her graduation. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, how to drive, and how to face the world with courage. He was her protector, her guide, and now he was gone. The pain in her chest was unbearable. She felt like a part of her had been ripped away, and no one seemed to understand how deep the hurt was. The room was filled with quiet whispers, but Emma couldn't focus on them. She couldn't focus on anything except her father's lifeless body. It seemed so strange to look at him now. The man she had known, laughed with, and hugged, was now cold and still. He was no longer the man who had made her feel safe in the world. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and slowly walked to the side of the coffin. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching the smooth wood of the casket. The room seemed to grow stiller, as if holding its breath, waiting for what Emma would do next. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt an overwhelming need to be close to him one last time. With shaking hands, she carefully lifted the edge of the cloth that covered his body and bent down to place a kiss on his forehead. His skin was cool to the touch, and the smell of the room, the flowers, and the candles mixed together in a way that only seemed to make everything more difficult. Emma closed her eyes, letting the memories of her father flood her mind. The sound of his voice, the way he laughed, the warmth of his hugs. Tears started to well up in her eyes again, and before she could stop herself, she found herself leaning into the coffin. She wrapped her arms around her father's body, holding him as if she could somehow bring him back, as if her embrace could fix everything. The sobs came quickly, shaking her entire body. Her heart felt as though it had cracked wide open, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. For a few moments, Emma just stood there, clinging to the lifeless body of the man she had loved her whole life. She wished she could have one more moment with him, just to hear him speak, just to feel his comforting presence again. But that wasn't possible. She had to let go. Yet, as Emma held on to her father, a strange sensation washed over her, something she couldn't quite explain. She felt warmth, as though she were wrapped in a soft, gentle light. It was unlike anything she had ever felt before. The room seemed to fall silent, and for the first time since the funeral began, Emma felt a sense of calm, almost as if her father was telling her that everything would be okay. Her mind tried to make sense of what she was feeling. Could it be possible? Was it just a result of her overwhelming emotions, or was there something more to this moment? She couldn't say. But as she stayed there, in the stillness of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen. As Emma stood there, holding her father's body, something strange started to happen. At first, it was so subtle that she almost missed it. She felt a warmth, a kind of energy surrounding her, as if the air around her had shifted. It was gentle, like a soft hug, and for a moment, Emma thought she might be imagining it. Her emotions were running wild, and everything seemed blurry. Was this just part of the grief, or was something more happening? She wasn't sure, but the feeling didn't go away. The warmth started to grow stronger, and Emma couldn't ignore it. She pulled back slightly, looking at her father's face, his eyes closed as they had been when he had passed. His skin was pale, and he appeared so still, as though nothing had ever moved him. But the warmth around her was undeniable. It was as though his presence was still there, surrounding her, making everything feel different. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but not from fear. This was something else, something almost peaceful. Emma took a deep breath, blinking a few times, trying to clear her mind. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she couldn't ignore the way the warmth seemed to spread through her arms and chest. She placed her hand back on his, gently holding his cold fingers once again. The warmth didn't fade. It was still there, and it made her feel strangely comforted, as if her father's spirit was still close by. A few moments passed, and then it happened. Emma felt it again, but this time it was different. One of her father's fingers twitched, just a tiny movement, so small that at first she wasn't sure if it had really happened. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be? Was her mind playing tricks on her? She blinked again, focusing on his hand. Her heart skipped a beat as the twitch happened again, and this time it was clearer. It wasn't her imagination. His finger had moved. She pulled back quickly, stepping away from the coffin, her eyes wide with disbelief. The room seemed to stop for a moment, as if everyone was waiting for her to react. Emma's heart was racing now, and she couldn't take her eyes off her father's body. She looked around, unsure if anyone else had seen it. Was this some kind of sign? A strange coincidence, or was it something far beyond the realm of what she had ever imagined? Emma's mind was spinning, and she tried to make sense of what was happening. There was no logical explanation for what she had just seen. Her father had been dead for hours. His body was cold, lifeless. This shouldn't be possible. And yet, as she looked at him, something told her that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't imagining things. Her hands trembled as she reached for his hand once more, her fingers lightly brushing over the back of his hand. And then something even more unbelievable happened. She felt it again. This time, his fingers moved a little more, as if responding to her touch. It wasn't a strong movement, not like a full grasp, but there was something there. It was a tiny, subtle motion, but it was there, and it left Emma breathless. Was this a miracle, a mistake, or something else entirely? Emma didn't know, but she couldn't deny that something amazing had just happened. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to react, as the warmth continued to surround her. Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tried to process what had just happened. She stepped back slowly, her mind racing with confusion. What was going on? Was she imagining it? Had her grief somehow caused her to see things that weren't there? She glanced at the people around her, but no one seemed to notice anything unusual. The room was still, except for the quiet murmurs of family members who were waiting for the ceremony to continue. But Emma couldn't ignore what she had felt. The warmth, the energy, and most of all, the strange twitch of her father's hand. Her father, the man who had always been so full of life, had somehow stirred, even after death. It didn't make sense. How could this be possible? Her thoughts were a whirlpool, spinning faster and faster with no clear answers. She looked back at her father, still lying in the coffin. His face remained calm, as peaceful as it had been when she first saw him in this state. But his hand, it had moved. Her father had been gone for hours. There was no way that the movements she had seen could be explained by natural causes. And yet, as her eyes settled on his hand, she noticed something. His fingers, though stiff and cold, appeared slightly more relaxed than they had been just moments ago. Emma stepped closer again, hesitating for a moment. Her mind told her to walk away, to step back and allow the process of mourning to continue, but her heart urged her to stay. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she touched his fingers. They were cool to the touch, but there was a faint warmth that seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips. She gasped quietly, feeling the gentle pulse, though it was weak, like the faintest throb of a heartbeat. Was this real? Emma wasn't sure. Her emotions were a tangled mess, and she wasn't certain whether her senses were being tricked. The warmth spread up her arm, as if his presence was still there, still somehow holding on. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she quickly pulled her hand away, looking around nervously to see if anyone had noticed. No one was watching her. They were lost in their own thoughts, wrapped in their own grief, completely unaware of the extraordinary moment happening right before Emma's eyes. Her eyes returned to her father, and for the first time since his passing, she didn't feel the crushing weight of sorrow. Instead, There was a strange sense of peace, a quiet hope that seemed to linger in the air. It was as if her father was telling her not to be afraid, that everything was going to be okay. But how could that be? Emma didn't understand. Her father had been gone for so long. His body had already grown cold, and yet it seemed like some force, was holding him there, still connected to this world. The idea of it was almost too much for Emma to bear, but she couldn't turn away. She couldn't stop herself from trying to understand what was happening. The room was still silent, the only sounds the soft whispers of her family in the background. Emma's thoughts raced as she carefully placed her hand back on her father's. She held it gently, as though afraid that if she applied too much pressure, the illusion would vanish. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, hoping for some sort of sign, some explanation for what was going on. When she opened them again, she couldn't believe what she saw. His fingers had moved again, just slightly, but it was unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. Emma couldn't keep the tears from streaming down her face as she whispered, "Dad." The word came out so quietly, so softly, but it carried with it all the love and longing she had ever felt for him. Would he respond? Would he truly come back to her, even if just for a moment? Emma's voice broke the stillness in the room as she whispered her father's name, "Dad." The word felt fragile on her lips, as if speaking it aloud might shatter the moment. She had never expected this, never imagined that in her lifetime she would see anything like this happen. Her mind couldn't quite wrap around the impossible, and yet she couldn't deny what she was feeling. Her father's hand had moved. The warmth had spread through her, and now there was a strange pull in the air, as though something was waiting to happen. For a long moment, nothing happened. The room around her remained quiet, the soft hum of murmurs and the distant sounds of the funeral service continuing in the background. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. Emma, however, stood still, her heart racing as she stared at her father's body. Her hand rested lightly on his cold fingers, and she felt the same faint pulse from earlier. It wasn't a heartbeat, she knew that, but there was something undeniable about the sensation. Her mind raced through every possible explanation, but none seemed to fit. She had seen his body, cold and still, just moments ago. She had touched him, and he had been lifeless. There was no way his fingers should be moving, no way he should still be giving off warmth. And yet here she was, standing over him, feeling this impossible connection. Suddenly, her father's fingers twitched again, this time with a little more strength. It wasn't just a random movement. It was deliberate, like a response. Emma's breath caught in her throat as her father's hand lifted slightly, as though he were trying to reach out to her. Her eyes widened in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Was it a dream? Was she still caught in some kind of grief-stricken fantasy? She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the emotions swirling inside her. She looked around at her family, but no one was paying attention. They were too lost in their own sadness, their own moments of mourning. Emma was the only one who seemed to be experiencing this miraculous event. She reached out again, her fingers trembling as they brushed against her father's hand. "Please, Dad," she whispered softly, almost pleading. "If you can hear me, if you can feel me, I need you." The words came from a place of deep longing, a wish that she couldn't put into any other words. She just needed to feel him, to know that he was still there somehow. She needed something to hold on to, a sign that everything wasn't lost. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get any more surreal, it happened. Her father's hand shifted slightly, and his thumb brushed against her palm. It was a small movement, but to Emma, it felt like the entire world had shifted. Her father had responded. He had touched her, even in this strange, impossible state. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she didn't even try to stop them. She let them fall freely, unable to hold back the flood of emotions that had been building up inside her since his death. The room seemed to blur around her as Emma continued to hold her father's hand, refusing to let go. Every inch of her body ached, but there was a strange peace in this connection. She didn't understand it. She couldn't explain it. But in that moment, she didn't need to. Her father's presence was with her again. And somehow, that was enough. "Dad," she whispered again, her voice shaking with emotion. "Please don't go." She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how much time she had left with this strange, miraculous moment, but she wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. As Emma held her father's hand, she felt a surge of emotions overwhelm her. She could hardly believe what was happening. His fingers had moved again, and there was a warmth spreading from his hand into hers. Her thoughts raced, and the room seemed to shrink around her as she tried to process everything. Her father, who had been gone for hours, was showing signs of life. It was impossible, unbelievable, and yet here she was, standing beside him, feeling his presence as if he were still there. The funeral home was quiet, the soft murmur of her family's conversations in the background, but Emma didn't hear any of it. All that mattered to her was the strange miracle unfolding right before her eyes. Her father's hand, which had been still and lifeless moments ago, was now responding to her touch. His fingers had twitched, then moved, and now they seemed to grip hers just a little bit tighter, as if he was trying to reassure her. It felt so real, so solid, that Emma couldn't bring herself to believe it was just her imagination. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. Was it possible? Could her father really be coming back to life? She glanced at his face, still peaceful in his final sleep. His features were unchanged, and yet his hand in hers told a completely different story. It was as if the boundary between life and death had blurred, and Emma was caught in the middle of it all. Suddenly, a quiet gasp came from the doorway. Emma's eyes snapped up, and she saw one of her relatives, a distant cousin, standing in the frame. He was staring at her, eyes wide, unsure of what he was witnessing. The others hadn't noticed yet, and Emma quickly turned to them, unsure of how to explain what was happening. She didn't have the words. She didn't know how to explain it, because she herself didn't understand it. Her cousin took a cautious step forward, his eyes glued to her and her father's hand. Is he moving?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Emma didn't answer right away. She was still processing everything in her own mind. Her father's fingers had moved. There was no denying it, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something bigger than her, something beyond human understanding. Before she could speak, her cousin looked around the room at the rest of the family. Someone needs to call a doctor," he said urgently, his voice rising with panic. He turned quickly, heading toward the door. Emma's heart raced. No, she didn't want a doctor. She didn't want anyone to come in and take this moment away. She didn't want to lose the connection she felt with her father, even if it was impossible. But the reality of the situation was hitting her hard. If someone else saw what was happening, there was no way they would believe it without medical help. They would think it was a mistake, an accident, something explainable by science. But to Emma, it felt like more than that. She squeezed her father's hand tighter, her eyes welling with fresh tears. "Dad, please," she whispered again, desperate for him to respond. "Don't leave me. Please don't go." At that moment, it felt as though time slowed down. The world around her seemed to fade, and all that mattered was her father's hand in hers. She couldn't explain it, but there was something in the way his fingers held hers that made her feel like he was trying to say something to her. The warmth radiating from his body grew, as though he was drawing strength from somewhere deep within, somewhere beyond what Emma could understand. Emma wasn't sure how much longer this moment would last. She wasn't sure if she would ever truly understand what had happened. But she knew one thing for certain. This was a moment she would never forget. The impossible had happened, and for just a little while, her father was with her again. And that was all that mattered in that moment. Emma's heart was racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and wonder. She still couldn't fully understand what was happening, but the warmth that surrounded her father's body and the gentle movements of his hand were impossible to ignore. Her eyes were locked on his hand, still resting in hers, as if it were trying to speak to her in a language she couldn't quite understand. She had to blink a few times, almost as if she were trying to wake herself up from a dream. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was all just a figment of her imagination, she couldn't deny the reality of what she was feeling. Her cousin had already left the room to get help, but Emma barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on her father, her hand still holding his with a gentle but firm grip. The funeral home had grown quiet, and everything seemed to fade away in the face of this impossible event. The whispers and murmurs from her relatives had turned into a dull hum, like the background noise of a distant world she couldn't reach. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but it didn't help. Her emotions were a chaotic mess of joy, confusion, disbelief, and fear. Could it be? Was this some kind of miracle? Was her father really coming back to life, or was it just a strange trick of the mind? She couldn't tell. It felt like her world had been turned upside down. Just hours ago, she had said her final goodbyes. She had kissed his forehead, told him she loved him, and believed with all her heart that she would never see him again. And now, here she was, holding his hand, feeling warmth, feeling movement. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, still not sure whether to laugh or cry. Everything about this moment felt so unreal, and yet it was happening. As the seconds passed, the warmth from her father's hand seemed to grow, not just in her hand but spreading up her arm, across her chest, and even to her heart. It was as if he was reaching out to her in a way that words never could. She felt it, deep inside her, a quiet connection that transcended the physical world. Her father's presence was still there, in some form, and it was more comforting than she had ever expected. Her mind kept racing. What should she do? What did this mean? Should she call someone, or should she stay right where she was? She looked at his face again, as peaceful as ever, his eyes still closed. The movements of his hand had stopped, but the warmth remained, like an invisible thread that tied them together. She held his hand even more gently now, afraid to let go, even though she knew she had to at some point. She was so focused on her father that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until they were nearly at the door. Emma quickly turned her head, and her cousin entered the room with a doctor close behind. The doctor looked at her with a confused expression, but Emma wasn't sure what she should say. "I don't understand," she whispered, still holding her father's hand tightly. He moved. His hand moved. The doctor, still unsure, moved closer to the coffin, inspecting the body with a practiced eye. He didn't say anything at first, just placed his hand gently on the side of her father's chest, checking for signs of life. Emma held her breath, hoping, praying that something, anything, would happen. And then, just as the doctor prepared to make his assessment, it happened again. Her father's hand shifted, this time more clearly, as though he was trying to lift it. Emma gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Dad?" she said, her voice trembling. She couldn't believe it. The doctor stepped back, startled, his face filled with shock. This isn't possible," the doctor said, his voice low and uncertain. He looked between Emma and her father's body, not sure what to make of the situation. Emma, not knowing what else to do, held her father's hand even more firmly, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was happening, something that defied all logic and understanding. Was it a miracle? Was her father somehow still with her, even in this strange way? Emma didn't know. She only knew one thing. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The room had fallen silent. The only sound now was Emma's quick breathing and the soft shuffle of the doctor's shoes on the floor. Her father's hand remained in hers, still warm, still faintly twitching as if it had a life of its own. Emma couldn't bring herself to look away. She was both terrified and amazed, unsure if this was truly happening, or if her mind had created some sort of dream that she couldn't escape. The doctor took another step back, glancing from Emma to her father. His face was a mix of confusion and disbelief. This can't be happening. He muttered under his breath, but Emma could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had been in the business of life and death for years, and yet what he was witnessing now defied everything he had ever learned. "Doctor, you saw it too," Emma said, her voice shaking. His hand, it moved. "I wasn't imagining it. I swear." The doctor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved slowly to the side of the coffin, checking her father's pulse. Even though he knew it would be pointless, her father had been gone for hours now. He had declared the time of death himself. Yet here they were, with no explanation for what was happening. Emma's eyes never left her father. The warmth in her hand was still there, but it was more than that. It felt like an unspoken connection, as though her father was trying to tell her something. Something she couldn't understand but could feel deep within her soul. Every part of her wanted to believe that this was real, that somehow her father was still here with her. "Emma," the doctor said softly, snapping her back to reality. "I don't know how to explain this, but I don't think this is normal. We should get a team in here, someone who can help. There might be something, some medical explanation." But Emma shook her head, her grip tightening around her father's hand. "No, I don't want anyone else. I don't want to lose this." The doctor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He had seen many things in his career, but this was something far beyond his understanding. He looked at Emma for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to challenge her. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "I understand, but you must be careful. If something's happening here, we need to be prepared." Emma nodded without taking her eyes off her father. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't ready to let go. She didn't want to be told it was impossible. She didn't want to hear that it was just her mind playing tricks. She wanted this to be real. The doctor stepped back, signaling to a few family members who had gathered near the doorway. They were watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. Emma could hear their whispers, but she didn't let it distract her. She could feel her father's hand stir slightly under her touch again, a faint motion, a signal that he was still there. She couldn't explain it, but her heart told her that he was trying to reach out. Time seemed to stretch as Emma stood there, holding his hand. It felt like hours had passed in the span of just a few moments. The room felt heavy with anticipation. Emma couldn't explain the feeling that had settled deep within her. There was no scientific explanation, no logical reason for this. And yet she couldn't let go of the feeling that something extraordinary was happening. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope, of a connection that seemed to stretch across the boundary between life and death. She didn't care what anyone else thought. She didn't care what was possible or impossible. She only cared about the feeling of her father's hand in hers, the warmth, and the slight movements that made her heart flutter. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please come back to me. I need you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt like she wasn't alone. The impossible had become possible, and she wasn't ready to let go. The silence in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of Emma's breathing and the occasional murmur from her relatives who stood nearby. The doctor had stepped back, unsure of what was happening, but Emma remained focused on her father's hand. She could feel it clearly now, a gentle warmth that pulsed with each slight movement. It was as if her father was still trying to communicate with her, even though his body lay still in the coffin. Her heart ached, and she couldn't stop the tears from falling. She had never imagined this moment would come. She had accepted that her father was gone, that his spirit had left this world. But now, in this strange, inexplicable moment, it felt as though he was still with her. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Not when this connection still held her so tightly. "Emma," one of her relatives said quietly, stepping forward. It was her aunt, who had been standing near the door, watching the scene unfold with a look of concern. "Sweetheart, maybe it's time to let go." But Emma shook her head, not even looking at her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not yet. I don't think he's gone. Not yet. Her aunt paused, her face softening with understanding. She didn't know what to say. None of them did. They could see the way Emma was holding her father's hand, the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly with each passing second. It was impossible. It defied every law of science and medicine they had ever known. And yet, here they were, witnessing something they couldn't explain. Emma's grip on her father's hand tightened, as though afraid to let go and risk losing this precious moment forever. She could feel the warmth growing stronger, like the soft pulse of life itself. The movements were subtle, almost like a gentle reassurance, as if he was telling her, "I'm still here." She could hear the words in her heart, even if they weren't spoken aloud. Her mind was still racing, trying to understand what was happening, but it felt as though the world had paused, just for her. The room, the people around her, all of it faded away, leaving her alone with her father in this moment that felt both impossible and incredibly real. Emma didn't know how long it had been since the doctor had first arrived, or since her cousin had run out to fetch help. Time had lost all meaning. All that mattered was her father's hand, and the quiet, undeniable connection that still lingered between them. Is he really coming back? Someone whispered from the back of the room. The question hung in the air like a delicate thread, but Emma didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't have the answers. She wasn't sure if anyone did. What she did know was that, right then, her father was with her. His presence surrounded her, like a comforting embrace, and for the first time since his death, she didn't feel as if she were walking through a world of darkness. The doctor, who had been standing back, observing quietly, finally spoke. I don't know what's going on here, but whatever it is, we need to take every precaution. If this is real, if your father is somehow—" "Please," Emma interrupted, her voice full of emotion. "Please don't take him away. I just need a little more time." The doctor hesitated, clearly torn. But then he nodded slowly, as though he understood something that couldn't be put into words. "All right," he said softly, stepping back. "We'll wait." And so they did. Emma held her father's hand, refusing to let go, as the room remained still. The warmth of his touch was undeniable, and although no one else could feel it the way she did, they couldn't deny the incredible bond that had formed between them in that moment. Whether it was a miracle, a trick of the mind, or something even more profound, Emma didn't care. All that mattered was that, for just a little while longer, she had her father by her side. The room was quiet now, but in Emma's heart there was a soft whisper, a message of hope, love, and connection that would stay with her forever. Even if this moment was fleeting, even if the miracle would soon fade, she knew that her father's love would always remain with her. And that was enough.